Today, the hidden world of sex workers. It's seldom discussed, but the identity of sex workers and the battle for workers' rights are being brought into the mainstream with the help of books and films. Joining me are two authors who've written very personal accounts about the subject. Poet, novelist, artist Leila Mottley's debut novel is a New York Times bestseller. She was 19 when her book Nightcrawling was published. She's the youngest writer ever to be selected for Oprah Winfrey's book club. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. Also joining me, author, activist and sex worker Antonia Crane. Her memoir is called Spent. It's been described as bold, brash, brutal and beautiful. Hello.
Hey.
Thank you for being here. Now, both of you are guests at this week's Festival America. It's an event in Paris that celebrates American writers. Your books tell the complex, layered, nuanced stories of survival as sex workers in America. How vital is it in 2022, at a time when women's rights are under threat in America, that these kind of women's stories are told?
Who would you like to speak first?
Antonia.
Sure. Thanks, Eve. It's a crazy year, as we've talked about before, for women's rights. And with Roe v. Wade being overturned, it's more important than ever and vital for women's voices and women's stories to be told in an intersectional way, because we're basically not being treated as full human beings with bodily autonomy right now. And also I want to stand in solidarity with the women in Tehran right now with what's going on there, and support and solidarity there. But sex workers, that's the point of view that's missing, is the point of view of sex workers. And there's tons of stories out there, and there's more forthcoming. So I'm really excited about that.
And Leila, Nightcrawling tells the story of 17-year-old Chiara and her older brother Marcus in Oakland, which is where you're from. Their mum is in a halfway house. Their dad is dead. Chiara eventually finds herself as a sex worker because she's desolate. The story is inspired, though, by a harrowing true story. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, in 2016, a case broke in the Bay Area where a young girl was sexually abused by various different members of Bay Area police departments, and I was 13 or 14 at the time that this came out, and I remember just hearing everyone talking about it, and the focus was always on the police department and the impact of this on the police department, and very little was about the kind of systemic implications that this had on girls and women everywhere, really, and we continue to neglect stories of police sexual violence, which are always interrelated to sex work.
And Antonia, your book is also based on a true story, written in the first person. In this case, the story is your own story, your depiction of life as a sex worker. Describe it to us.
My book, well, and my life. I've been a sex worker for 29 years and an activist for longer. And I think with that police violence against sex workers and the incarceration of an entire group of workers that includes thousands and thousands of different kinds of people, not just women, but non-binary and trans women, is being incarcerated, needs to be addressed. And my story is my journey through the sex industry for 29 years, the unionization effort at the Leslie Lady in 1996 to 1998, and my mother's death. And so the body politic of my love for my mother and my love for the sex industry and my journey through the sex industry is really what my book is about.
And Leila, in your book, Chiara falls into sex work through kind of a drunk misunderstanding. She's poor and her body becomes her main resource. Antonia, in Spent, you write, girls I knew binged on cupcakes and cocaine when holes were punched through their hearts as the people they loved died. Others went shopping. I walked into strip clubs, casinos and hotels and offered my body to strangers for money. However, you never tell us how we should think about sex for money. But it is a profession that's still clouded very much in shame. Sex workers are still very much demonized, aren't they?
They are. They're stigmatized. It's a very stigmatized workforce. And that's something that I think with the multiplicity of stories being told, when you tell your story and when you hear a story, you can't hate that person. It actually brings you closer to change and destigmatizing these stories. So mine is just one of a million. And so we need to change it with stories. And I think that stories have the power to do that, to make a story that may seem unrelatable, relatable. And the love story in my book is with my mother and the industry. I love the industry, and that's why I'm always fighting for change.
And your book is very frank from the very first chapter with the scabby man. Both of you write about sex in detail and in ways that I've rarely seen before. Leila, do you think there are limits about the way we can write about sex?
I mean, I think that we try to place limits on the way that we write about sex, but I think that that's counterproductive for us, that we need to, kind of face it as what it is, and also recognize that sex comes in many different forms, as well as sex work, and that, often the primary danger that we face is in the criminalization of sex work, and the way that that ends up putting sex workers in positions of danger and lack of safety. But the job itself is not the thing to be criticized.
And earlier this year, I'm not sure you saw it, but a Bollywood film called Gangubai Kathiawadi premiered at the Berlin Film Festival. It drew attention to how sex work isn't recognised as a profession in most societies. I know your book talks a lot about the historic and growing labour battle for sex workers' rights. Tell us a little bit more about what you're fighting for.
Yeah, well, I've been waiting for 27 years for strippers to join together and build power as a workforce and unionize again and make that decision. And in California, that's actually happening right now on the ground. We've been picketing for 6 months in front of Star Garden, a topless club in northern Hollywood, North Hollywood. And we are pushing for safer working conditions. And it's funny, right? Because you think that a lot of people with the movies and TV and films that you see, stripping is not legitimized as a job. They think that it's just something that's done on the weekends, or it's like a fun job, but it is actually just a legit, hard. grubby job. And it's a beautiful and fun job as well. And it is a job that is difficult and strenuous in a lot of different ways. And it deserves all of the rights, human rights and regulation and destigmatization, and they deserve workers' rights, and they deserve to not be stigmatized and extorted and trafficked, and they deserve an anti-racist discrimination policy that has teeth and weight and that can really make a difference in these clubs for the workforce that is incredibly intersectional and dynamic and vibrant. And they're just workers like all other workers that deserve the human rights that all workers deserve. And it's just funny that here we are in 2022 thinking about who is human enough to deserve human rights and workers' rights. And we really need to join together and make sure that that happens, because courage is contagious, and there's no better time than right now.
Well, your books are both very powerful. You talk very powerfully about it, but in your book as well. Leila, Nightcrawling was published when you were a teenager. You started writing it, I think, when you were 16. As well as sex work, you're covering gender, justice, poverty, family, dynamics. What do you hope to achieve in your stories going forward?
I mean, I really wanted to give validity and voice to the vulnerability of Black girls, what it means to walk in this world in a body that is entirely unprotected. And so I really hope that many of us, kind of interrogate the ways that we are complicit in the harm of Black girls.
Talk a bit more about that, because in the book you show how different it is to grow up as a Black boy and a Black girl. Why is it so different?
I mean, I think that the gendered ways in which we're raised end up having these reverberations throughout our lives. And with Kiara, she ends up kind of being taught from such a young age that her role is to take care of everyone, that when her brother and her end up on their own, he decides that what is most important for him is to chase his dream, and she is left to figure out how to survive. And I think that that's something that often Black girls pick up without ever even being asked.
And Antonia, and we're coming to the end of the interview, there's still lots to talk about, but sex workers are often portrayed as happy hookers or tragic victims. But you are really trying to change this narrative along with many others now. Do you think there'll be a time when sex work is accepted into the mainstream?
Absolutely. I think we're inches and seconds away from that. And I think that, I agree with what Leila's saying, that we need to look at how gender roles are, how they affect our lives as young people growing up in society, and economic need and turbulent circumstances and racism can really shape a young person's life. And sex work is one way that people get by and survive. I think that all sex work is intrinsically queer, and I think that it's all intrinsically survival sex work, but it is also empowering, and I think that it's changing.
Okay. Thank you both so much for being here with us. It's been a real pleasure. Leila Mottley's book is called Nightcrawling. Antonia Crane's is called Spent. Both have been translated into French. We're going to leave you now with a French film that shreds some of the cliches about sex work. Her Way is from Cécile Ducroc. Remember our website. We're also on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.
T'as déjà fait une lettre de motivation?
Bah ouais, bien sûr. Bonjour monsieur, j'aimerais beaucoup vous sucer pour un max de pognon. Salutations à votre épouse, bien cordialement.
Arrête, t'es conne. Je vais te payer Péronnier.
T'as fait un prêt?
Je vais aller bosser ailleurs. 39 ans et les plus belles jambes d'Alsace-Lorraine. J'ai vraiment besoin de ce boulot.
Je sais qui t'a arnaqué un club.
Regarde-toi là. C'est une esclave comme les autres, c'est tout.
Versailles, Mont-Saint-Michel, the Louvre are well-known stars of French heritage. But French genius and France harbours many other hidden treasures. The arts, gastronomy, architecture, as well as nature's wonders. Come along with France 24. Discover France's living heritage. From young apprentices to accomplished craftsmen and farmers, to Michelin star sporting chefs, meet these people whose passion for their professions preserve and drive French heritage.
You are here on France 24 and France24.com.